Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently we are in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And as we are now moving through, it's been a long journey for David. He was anointed king, or actually called by God and anointed by the prophet. Remember him, he was probably around 16 or 17. And as we will kind of chart the journey here, he becomes king at 30. And then there's still this transition. And in many ways, he will never actually get over the ideal of those from the house of Saul. They are still around, but for the most part, when he became king, you had Abner, for his own reasons, decided he was going to try to manipulate for power. And then Joab kills him. Okay, Joab, David's military leader, and we're going to get to him later in a moment. How he maintains his reign. I don't know why David did not dispose of him before. We're going to get to the inciting incident here, but there's a lot of family with David. Zariah is his sister. Zariah, how you want to pronounce the name, anyway, is his sister. Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, remember, were Zerah's sons, making them David's nephews. Asahel is killed. Joab and Abishai takes vengeance on Abner for killing him, Asahel. David sees this right away, and he says, well, these guys are furious, right? They are excellent warriors. However, like I say, I don't know why David did not dispose of them there. But anyway, he's going to complicate it more. But anyway, I think behind the scenes, you also see God working, because God did not want this connection between the house of Saul and the house of David. And so you kind of you see this kind of rooting out, this separation. Abner, who at the time had one of Saul's sons, whom later two guys murdered, and so Abner was going to get rid of him anyway because he didn't like what he said. And so he said, he accused Isabel, Beth accused Abner of sleeping with his concubine, or one of his father's concubine. That incensed Abner, and he said, well, I'm going to give the kingdom to David. Now the problem, of course, Abner didn't realize he was not in control. He certainly didn't control anything that God would have had, right? And especially with David. Now, on the natural level, when we look at it, yeah, had Abner done that, it would have been disastrous for David, because Abner would have been in control with half the kingdom. And you still have people, and he will always have people. Even later on in his life, you always have people that never got over how David became king, even though Saul died in battle, that David had nothing to do with Saul's death. All right, so chapter 5 starts off with David actually becoming king over all of Israel. Now, remember, the first, really you could say, Well, the first 7 years, David is ruling in Jerusalem, Hebron. And here he is going to now, Israel will become united. Now, later on, after you can almost say David's grandson will divide the nation again. We'll get to that down the road. Verse 1, he says, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, here we are, your own flesh and blood. Even while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led us out to battle and brought us back. And the Lord also said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel. Now, what is amazing with this here is that notice they know the word of the Lord. They know the word of the Lord. And yet it's been 7 years since, they've been out there. And now they come to David and said, hey, be king, right? Be king over all of Israel. Now that's kind of amazing there. Verse 3, so all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron. King David made a covenant with them at Hebron in the Lord's presence, and they anointed David king over Israel. Now, remember, you had and later this is going to come back again, so that later you're going to have a northern kingdom, which is Israel, and then you will have a southern kingdom, which is Judah. It's not designated at this point. It was just that David ruled in the Judean parts, and then you could almost say some of the remnants of the house of Saul was reigning in Israel, but now they're one. And so David is now ruling in all of Israel. He has consolidated, he has brought them together. Verse 4, David was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So one nation at this time that he reigned over. And what is interesting here, up until the Babylonian, so just say for 80 years, let's say 80 plus, as he because as he gets into the beginning of his grandson, and we'll get to him later. When we get to his grandson, he's going to divide the land. So just really an 80-year span, little over 80-year span, where Israel will be united as one nation, and then after that, they will never be a united nation again. Until after the Babylonian Empire. But after that Babylonian Empire, they are not a freestanding nation. So they're going to go through one world kingdom after another. Babylonian, the Median Persian, the Grecian kingdom, Roman Empire. And of course, they're out of covenant now. If you want to say today that they are a freestanding nation, but not under God. Okay. All right. Verse 6, the king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the land. Now, the Jebusites, remember, had always been around. As we see, they've been around for thousands of years at this point. The city is Jerusalem. All right. So then the Jebusites had said to David, you will never get in here. Even the blind and lame can repel you, thinking David can't get in there. So they're like, our blind and our blind people can beat your greatest men, right? Yet David did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. Now, we're going to see that the city of David is actually Jerusalem, right? But you can also see the names here, because you hear some of this names here. Now the stronghold there, remember, is the word simply means kind of a fortified city or fortified fort or something like that. But notice the mention of Zion. That is, notice he said the city of David, and then we're going to see later that it is Jerusalem. Okay. Now, he said, yet David, verse 7, did capture the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. He said that day, whoever attacks the Jebusites must go through the water shaft to reach the lame and the blind, who are despised by David. For this reason it is said, the blind and lame will never enter the house. So he captures it, okay. Verse 9, David took up residence in the stronghold, which he named the city of David. He built it up all the way around from the supporting terrace inward. David became more and more powerful, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David. He also sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and there they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and had exalted the kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. Then it says, verse 13, after he arrived from Hebron, David took up more concubines and wives from Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the name of those born to him in Jerusalem: Shabab, Nathan, Solomon. Now, it's interesting that the writer here is giving us kind of a parenthetical, right? Ipar, Elishu, Nepheg, Jephthah, Elijah, Elada, and Eliphit. Okay. Again, excuse my butchering the pronunciation of these names. Verse 17. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went in search of David, but he heard about it and went down to the stronghold. So the Philistines came and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Then David inquired of the Lord, should I go to war against the Philistines? And when you hand them over to me, the Lord replied to David, go, for I will certainly hand the Philistines over to you. Now, what is amazing here, you see David inquiring of the Lord, and this will be one of his things here where he continually inquires of the Lord. But then in certain instances he doesn't inquire of the Lord, and that seems like that's when he get into a lot of the trouble. Verse 20, it says, so David went to Baal Perazim and defeated them there, and said, like a bursting flood, the Lord has burst out against the enemies before me. Therefore he named the place the Lord burst out. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them off. Now this is interesting here, right here. When it says that the Philistines abandoned their idols and David and his men carried them off. It doesn't give us detail, but the question is why? Well, why did they carry the idols off? Now, we don't have any information. It could mean, it doesn't say. I don't get that's there. I'll tell you why in a moment. But it could mean that they carried them off and melted them down. It could mean that they made them into swords. The other issue is that Israel, up until all the way from their history to the present here, and then all the way to the Babylonian exile, idolatry was always their major downfall. And remember, as the story is being told to us, the focus on the biblical narrative Okay, it doesn't give us all the details. We're looking at is David, some of his exploits, some of his faults, but the main purpose is the seed of David being preserved. Okay, the seed of David being preserved. But there is a lot of sin in the background. Now, this is important because sometimes people ask the question, why? Later on, we're going to see where God is going to plague the nation. There's like this great famine, and they're going to, well, why is this famine happening? And you see that really deep down that there's just a lot of sin that is going on with them. Now you see this right here. That notice this, that David and his men carried them off, meaning the idols. Not a lot of focus on it, but notice in the background when you see then these judgment happens, the famines, the plague sometimes, behind the scenes there's a lot of sin. And the narrative is just focused on just kind of, telling of one story. Just as I said before, even like when you think about around Israel, remember around Israel there's all kinds of nations going on, pagan, corrupt, violent nations. Verse 22, the Philistines came up again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, do not make a frontal assault, circle around behind them and attack them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, act decisively, for then the Lord would have marched out ahead of you to attack the camp of the Philistines. David did exactly as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gebar to Gezer. Okay, so if you know what that is, then you know how far that is. Never been to Israel. I'm being comical here because I've never been to Israel, so I don't know. All right. One note here before we go, as we go to the next study in this one, we see for the first time the establishing of Jerusalem. The Jebusites had held Jerusalem up until this point, so it was a pagan city. David conquers this city. Now, one of the things that you'll see when we get to the Chronicles is that David asks anyone who conquers the city can be military king. That is one of the reasons why Joab, his nephew, became kind of military leader for life. Like I say, when David had the chance to kind of get rid of him, because Joab, though he was a genius and a very skilled military leader, he was also incredibly wicked. Incredibly wicked. But anyway, so this is why Jerusalem then becomes the capital city. Not only does Jerusalem become the capital city, it becomes the holy city that we now see going all the way into even the prophetic future, right? And one of the things about Jerusalem is that it is built upon we're going to see this throughout the Old Testament, that the high places, these pagan high places, which were built upon high elevated lands, right? And Jerusalem is built upon a high elevated, the city of Jerusalem. So in that respect, you're always kind of going up to Jerusalem or coming down from Jerusalem, right? Because it is elevated high. In the pagan world, they always thought that the higher up elevation-wise you get, the closer you get to the pagan gods. God chooses Jerusalem as his holy city. As I said, that takes us all the way, that we know that the new city Jerusalem, for example, is named. So there's just something about the city Jerusalem that God chooses as his place of worship here. Okay. All right. I'll see you in chapter 6, the next study.